Your Excellencies, dear faculty, students, and dear guests, welcome to the debate at the Hertie School tonight about ending the war in Ukraine and the prospects for a UN peacekeeping operation. More than 4 years after the annexation of Crimea by the Russian Federation and the military escalation in eastern Ukraine, a stable solution to the conflict still seems elusive. Negotiations have stalled and failed to produce meaningful results. The Minsk agreement is still not being implemented by the parties of the conflict. A number of politicians and experts in Ukraine, Russia, and other countries have recently called for the deployment of a UN peacekeeping force to Donbas. This debate could pave the way for de-escalating the conflict and trigger slow but meaningful progress toward conflict resolution. Tonight's speakers will discuss the political, administrative, and military prospects and requirements of a potential peacekeeping operation in eastern Ukraine. Each panelist will provide a short input statement, which is followed by a panel discussion and a Q&A with the audience, moderated by Professor Wolfgang Ischinger. After the event, we will have a reception outside the forum, and you're all invited to join us. Mr. Gabriel, we're very thrilled to welcome you back to the school. We have all very fond memories of your last visit here, which was just about a year ago, when you, together with Emmanuel Macron and Jürgen Habermas, discussed the future of Europe. And what a year it has been, ladies and gentlemen. Without further ado, let me pass the word to Wolfgang Ischinger, Professor of Security Policy and Diplomatic Practice here at the Hertie School and Chairman of the Munich Security Conference. As chair of the event, he will introduce our distinguished panelists, and all that remains for me to say is I wish that we all have an inspiring and productive discussion. Thank you very much, and welcome again.
So, thank you, Helmut. Thank you, President Anheier, for these welcoming remarks and for introducing the subject. I must say I'm really thrilled to have this opportunity to discuss the specific issue on our agenda, situation in Donbas, and the opportunity, hopefully, to take peace forward in Donbas through initiatives such as the UN mission idea, which has actually been invented, as I recall, by none other than Vladimir Putin himself many months ago. Before I introduce my wonderful panelists, including Minister Gabriel, and I'm really particularly grateful that former Minister Gabriel, I'm really extremely grateful for what you did, because he didn't even know that this event was planned until we sort of ran into each other last weekend. And I mentioned this and said, actually, you know, you would be the ideal person to participate, because you conducted many discussions about this particular issue over the last year. So why don't you come? And he was a good sport and looked at his calendar and said, fine. I'm coming. So let's give him a hand, would you? And that includes the whole panel, of course. But I do want to preface this with one word about the country about which we are talking. I had the privilege in 2014, when the Maidan conflict turned into from a Russian point of view, into a coup d'etat, and and then the annexation, the illegal annexation of Crimea, and all that follows. I had the opportunity to spend time in Ukraine on behalf of the OSCE in the spring and early summer of 2014. And without wishing to tell you a long story, I simply wanted to tell those of you who have not ever been to Ukraine or who have not had an experience to spend time with Ukrainians. This is a country that many of you, many Germans have never been to because it used to be behind the Iron Curtain. I was personally extremely surprised and also extremely pleased to see that I have not found a country with as vibrant a politically oriented civil society as Ukraine. Wherever I went to the provincial cities, there were groups of women and men and young women and old men and all sorts of groups on humanitarian issues, on social issues, on refugees, and on all other issues. In other words, it's wrong to think that this is a country that has not had opportunities to develop a rich civil society life. That's just a remark I wanted to make. We have these wonderful panelists, and I will now introduce them very briefly in the order in which they will make their initial remarks. We will start, because we're talking about Ukraine, we just discussed this before we came in here, with Ambassador Melnik. Ambassador Melnik has been here since actually 2014. He served before in this country as Consul General in Hamburg for a while and held senior appointments, as you can imagine, in the Ukrainian Foreign Ministry. So a warm welcome to you, Mr. Ambassador, dear Andre. The second one will be sort of the comment from the former German Foreign Minister, Sigmar Gabriel, who needs even less an introduction than all the others. He has been a member of the German Bundestag since 2005, but he's also served as a minister president and a senior cabinet member in the government of Lower Saxony. And of course, for the last year, almost exactly a year, after having been Minister of Economics, he served as the German Foreign Minister and was, of course, deeply involved in the discussions about the issue at hand. Number three is Andrzej Zagorski, whom I have known as long as I have known foreign policy. I think we first met when I was a very junior person in the Foreign Ministry's planning staff many years ago. Andrzej runs the Department for Disarmament and Conflict Resolution at the Primakov Institute of the Russian Academy of Sciences. And he's a professor there. And I want you to know that I've been extremely privileged to be invited to the Primakov readings last year and the year before, a kind of international conference event that your institute and Alexander Dynkin are organizing. So thanks for coming all the way from Moscow. Klaus Mangold also needs no introduction. Klaus Mangold is, of course, a very experienced, high-ranking German business leader, has served on the board of, not only of Daimler, on the board of trustees and the supervisory boards of many companies. He is, by the way, a member of the trustees of the Hertie School of Governance. That is one reason why he's here. But regarding the issue at hand, it's important to know, for those of you who may be non-Germans, Klaus Mangold served for many years, until quite recently, as the chairman of what we call the Ostausschuss, which is the association of the German business community that is focused on doing business not only with Russia and Ukraine, but with a whole range of countries to our east and southeast. So welcome, Klaus. Number four is Klaus. Number five, last but not least, is Katja Kloger. If you have not had a chance to buy her recent book, you should buy it. I have to say, I had the privilege of helping to present the book when it came out, and of course, in preparation of this, I actually read it, and even, you know, I can say very modestly, I have spent quite a bit of time in my life reading stuff about Russia and Russian history and German-Russian relations. And I wrote memos when I was in the policy planning department about this relationship. I learned a tremendous amount of stuff that I did not know through your book. So as a professor, I'm telling you, buy the book, or at least read it if you don't want to buy it. Katja, of course, works with Stern. She's written a number of books. She's worked. She has worked as a correspondent in Moscow. She knows what she's talking about. This has been her main focus of her work as a very serious journalist. So welcome to you, Katja. So let's go straight into medias res and invite the ambassador to get us kicked off, please.
Well. First of all, thank you so much, dear Ambassador Ischinger, for this kind invitation to sit on this important panel, but first of all also to talk about a topic which is a very difficult one. I wish to make just 3 essential points in our discussion. The first point is Ukraine does welcome the fact that this initial proposal of our president about the deployment of international peacekeeping operation in the east of Ukraine that had, by the way, been officially submitted to the UN in March 2015, that this proposal, this initial proposal of Ukraine has finally received attention of our Western partners, but also in Russia as well. And in this sense, we as Ukrainians do appreciate the decision of the new federal government in Germany to include this crucial goal into the coalition agreement. This is not self-evident, and in that sense I would like to thank Minister Gabriel for your personal contribution as a chief negotiator of the coalition agreement, that this topic, which seems quite far to the wide German public, was or has been part now of this agreement, and that means that we have also the task of the government to participate in this endeavor. So there is now a new hope for the progress to end this war, this Russian war in Ukraine, and finally achieve sustainable progress after 4 years of negotiations, which have been quite active, but so far the results are not very satisfactory. My second point is what we now have on the table, and what Ambassador Ischinger has mentioned, is this idea of Putin from September 2017, which has given this new impetus to the idea which was in the air but was not, unfortunately, was not discussed in the last years, and that is a quite important step. Now, what we have this proposal of the Russian Federation, and the mission which is going to be deployed is called UN Support Mission to Protect the SMM, that means Special Monitoring Mission of the OSCE. Now we have a question. We are talking now about a full-fledged international peacekeeping mission, like we have had in the past, and you might feel now the difference. The difference is a very simple one. What we want and what we think might be helpful in this certain stalemate where we are now, also in the Normandy format, would be a peacekeeping mission with a robust mandate, an expensive one, and with a clear goal, with a clear objective to restore the integrity of Ukraine, and also guarantee a sustainable peace. What our Russian colleagues want is something very different. What we have to do with a purely cosmetic step so far of ensuring physical protection to the SMM monitors that, by the way, have been doing really a very effective job so far. And although in fact, there is a need to provide this physical protection for the SMM mission, since this mission has been terrified and harassed all these years. It would be not a bad idea, but in that sense, I think it would be easier that the Kremlin could just give a simple order to its troops and proxies to stop this harassment. And my question is a very simple one: how on earth could this ultra-soft half measure that has been proposed by the Russian side contribute to this conflict resolution where so much effort has been put also by the federal government, but we still have not a very solid result. So in a nutshell, we have this rather bizarre proposal that has nothing to do with the original peacekeeping mission spirit, and that would cost probably billions of euros, and also that the German taxpayer should also know that is not a easy solution. I mean, the mission, and we are speaking about maybe 20, maybe 30,000 persons that might belong to that mission in order to really achieve a tangible result. So it's really a serious step. So having that step and having in mind just the protection of the SMM monitors, we think that is too little, and that would be basically a misuse of the UN peacekeeping toolbox. And my last point is how do we assess? I think that, and this is our feeling, we are still quite optimistic, though we have this difference in approaches. Our idea from 15, the idea of Russian president from September 17. Since then, 7 months have passed, and unfortunately we have not moved. Unfortunately, not an inch in that process, but still, we believe, Ukraine believes that this mission has a chance, has a real chance to be successful. Our red line is very simple here, and I'm glad that the German government and our partners in the States share this vision. That should be a full-fledged mission, not just a cosmetic one, a full-fledged mission with a strong mandate that would control the whole territory of the occupied areas in Donbass, not just the front, not just the Kontlak line, and also that mandate should include 400 kilometers of Ukrainian-Russian border, which is out of control until now. We think that this mission of Blue Helmets is not a panacea, is not an end in itself. It should be a part, an important element of an overall strategy within the Minsk process, which should be continued, and we hope that the new German government would set new impulses in the next weeks already to continue the negotiation process in that important format, and also when all those puzzles would stick together. These ideas are not contradictory, they are supplementary, and we hope that we might give this new impulse, and let's discuss in which way we might achieve this new mandate of the mission. Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you very much. Excellent. So now we go straight to former Foreign Minister Gabriel.
So thank you very much, Ambassador Ischinger, and thank you very much for the invitation. First of all, I always have to beg your pardon for my English, because I'm sitting in front of an international school of governance. I have to explain that I was more engaged in politics during my school time than in learning English, so but I will try to do it. And the first thing I think we have to answer is why we are debating about a Blue Helm mission, a peacekeeping mission in the Ukraine. Why? Because since the first agreement in Minsk, 2014, and then the second one in 2015, everybody agreed to have a ceasefire, to withdraw the heavy weapons out of the conflict zone, and to start a political process which has different pillars and different issues, elections, clarifying the idea of the territories which today are partly occupied by in the Donbass. So there is an agreement where everybody agreed, and the SMM, the special mission from the OSCE, has only the obligation to control the implementation of this agreement of Minsk. But if you look into the reports of the SMM, you will see that nobody is respecting the ceasefire and the agreement to withdraw the heavy weapons. Both sides are violating the ceasefire agreements, sometimes with some 100 violations per day. It differs a little bit, and it isn't to see how difficult the situation is. You can see when both sides are agreeing to have a ceasefire on Easter, for example, or on Christmas. It's always something for the front page in the newspaper that they are agreeing on a ceasefire on special days in the year, although they all agreed to have a ceasefire for the whole region and to the withdrawal of the heavy weapons and getting them under control outside of the conflict areas. So, because we all saw that this ceasefire doesn't work, there was an international debate about internationalizing the conflict by asking the Security Council of the United Nations to send a robust to decide about a robust mandate for a Blue Helm mission in the region. It's true that the first proposal came out of the Ukraine. President Poroshenko was the first politician who proposed a peacekeeping mission in the Donbass, and I debated this idea, I think, since 2016 with the German Chancellor, Mrs. Merkel, and as well with Vladimir Putin. And at the very beginning, we saw that the Russian government, the Russian president, was very reluctant to this idea. Lavrov, but also Putin himself, they didn't want to engage in that way, and they all said there is an agreement in Minsk, everything is clarified, we should start the political process, and we do not need a peacekeeping mission. By the way, one of the biggest conflicts in 2 years debating was always that the Ukraine said it's impossible to start a political process during people are killing each other or violating the ceasefire. And the Russians always told us, we can only do more for the ceasefire if in the same time the political process will start. We argued in front of the Russian president that in Syria, for example, the Russians always told the rest of the world that it's necessary to have first a ceasefire, and they negotiated this in Astana and then in Sochi, and then afterwards we should come under the umbrella of the United Nations in Geneva together to negotiate the political process. And I asked Vladimir Putin why this solution is your idea for Syria, but not for the Ukraine. And after 2 years debate, we were astonished that I think 4 weeks before the last conference, General Assembly of the United Nations, Putin himself launched the idea of a mandate for a peacekeeping mission. We were not really sure which kind of solution he had in mind, but it was for us relatively astonishing that he was, after 2 years debating, 2 years of debate about this idea, he agreed to some kind of a Blue Helm mission in the east of Ukraine. And then, that's right, but the ambassador said the first proposal of Putin was only to have a Blue Helm mission on the so-called contact line. In German, in our language, in history would say at the front. But now we are searching for ways that, for words that nobody knows about what we are debating, so we call it contact line. Of course, we rejected this idea, and the Ukraine rejected the idea because it would have been a new border between Ukraine and the Donbass. And after a discussion between Chancellor Merkel and Vladimir Putin, he agreed to have a mandate for the Blue Helm mission for the whole range of the east of Ukraine, for the Donbass, where the mandate of the SMM is in place. So that means also at the border to Russia. This was a tremendous step forward from the Russian president, which were in the first days after his proposal for a Blue Helm mission, we all had the fear and the feeling that it was not that would not have been possible. But we saw, yes, there was a move towards a common idea about a Blue Helm mission. Of course, there are several other difficulties. The devil is always in the detail, and it's not only details. The question how the Donbass guys are the so-called separatists are part of the mission or not, who will have the control about them, what's the mandate of the SMM, what's the mandate of the Blue Helm mission. But I would say, whatever have been the arguments in the past, for me, this idea of a Blue Helm mission is the only way to come out of these dead-end street of the Minsk agreements, where I would say where we are today. We have, if you ask the ambassador who is heading the SMM and the Donbass, he will tell you that it's impossible for the guys from the SMM to go during the night in the region to control what's happening with the ceasefire, because it's dangerous. Not only dangerous because both sides are not so happy if the SMM supervisors will visit them. Then it's difficult to go to every part of the region. So it's necessary to protect them. If not, then especially during the night, both sides are preparing the violations for the ceasefire. To show you an example how crazy the situation is, sometimes one of both sides are using taking their weapons to go on the other side, shooting to their own territory, to go back and say, last night they attacked us, so now we have to answer. So it's maybe not a fair. It's not fair to look to Israel and Palestine, but this conflict, you have always the feeling that the radicals on both sides need each other. It's difficult for them if the other side would not have radicals. Then you have no argument to be radical for yourself. So, from my perspective, coming to a peacekeeping mission, but you're right, a robust mandate is the only way to come out, to control the ceasefire, to withdraw the heavy weapons, and then after a sustainable ceasefire to start again the negotiations about the political process in the Ukraine. If we will not come to this solution, I would say we will have this frozen or not frozen conflicts for years. And my difficulties in my former government was that I said, if Russia would agree to a Blue Helm mission, which we can accept in the West or in the Ukraine, and if we would have a sustainable ceasefire and the withdrawal of the heavy weapons, then we should start introducing parts of the sanctions. This is not the official position of the Ukraine, that's not the official position of Europe and of the German government, but I would say if there is no carrot, and if there is only a stick, then it will be very difficult to convince the Russian side. And so I would say we have to do our utmost to come to a negotiation table and to negotiate the conditions and the circumstances under which a peacekeeping mission should control the ceasefire and should control the withdrawal of the heavy weapons, because if not, I cannot see how we could start the political process, and which is absolutely necessary to come out of this difficult situation.
Thank you very much. And now we hear the voice from Russia. Andrei, just, you don't need to press a button, just start talking.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me. Probably the first thing I wanted to say is to emphasize that I'm not an official. I don't speak for my government. I speak as an academic who has spent at least the last 35 years in negotiations studies and conflict resolution studies, and as someone who belongs to a group of experts within the Primakov Institute who have looked into the issue and who have given themselves a thought about how this idea may work. We still approach the end of the story, but we spent some time on looking into this. Of course, there are many details, and the devil is often, always in details. That's why I will begin with a few brief points, thesis, and we may expand in the discussion time. My first point would be to say, if we succeed with the idea of deploying a reasonable peace operation in Donbass, this will be a huge and a very bold step toward establishing peace in Donbass and Ukraine in general. This will be a very radical step towards this goal. So this is why we believe it is important. Second, if we think of a peace operation in eastern Ukraine, it should build upon the Minsk agreements. It should help and should facilitate the implementation of the Minsk agreements rather than to supplement or rather than to replace Minsk agreements. So it should be in support of the implementation of the Minsk agreement. Number three, if we think of a reasonable and effective peace operation, one first criteria certainly would be that it should not be an operation which would help to freeze the conflict, but rather we should think of an operation which would bring us a step forward towards resolving the conflict in general. Although, of course, as an academic, and I'm not going to discuss whose position is right, whose is wrong. My job as an academic and looking at those issues is to identify the gap between the positions of different parties and to see for how we can close or at least narrow the gap and bringing about a compromising way. And of course, I do understand that if we want a successful peace operation, it should be robust enough to be able to, its first immediate task will be to consolidate the ceasefire, to take the news about death tolls and shootings in the area away from the headlines of the news, to make it an effective ceasefire possible. And of course, in order to live up to this challenge, the operation should be robust enough to be able to enforce the implementation of the ceasefire requirements by all parties, and at the same time should be able to defend itself. It should be able to defend civil population. it should be able to defend its mandate and should be able to enforce the ceasefire against any spoilers, and there are many in the ground in terms of paramilitary groups, etc. So it should be robust enough to live up to this task. I certainly see the difference in the official positions of Russia and Ukraine in terms of where the peacekeepers should be placed. This is why we think in terms of a phased approach, proceeding on the basis that the first and immediate task for the operation would be to stop hostilities at the line of contact. We would anticipate further expansion of the area of operation for the peacekeepers, ultimately taking under control the whole territory of the conflict. Next point would be to say a peace operation alone would not be sufficient in our view. What we need, and other people do think about it as well, we need to think about complementing a peace operation, which is would be there primarily for security purposes, to complement it what we would call extended international presences, which would take care of peace building in the area of conflict. There are different options of thinking about international presences. Many of them are being discussed in the academic circles. In different forms, including in form of some transitional international authority or administration, whatever else. But this would be an important element of helping the Minsk process further for the purpose that after the ceasefire is effectively established in the area of conflict, other tasks of peace building, including many tasks, including institutions building, elections, etc., are taken care by impartial international presences. If we succeed in this, I would believe that we would be on a reasonable path toward resolving the conflict. My last point would be to say, when I began working on these issues months ago, my major inspiration was to think that if we are successful in doing this, this would be a great step towards not only resolving the Ukraine conflict, but also could be a beginning of repairing the European security architecture, as well as repairing the Russia-West relationship. What I see now is that the negative agenda in Russia-West relations is expanding rapidly, including more and more issues. And increasingly, this expansion increasingly overshadows the Ukraine conflict. I see more headlines about other issues than the Ukraine conflict. And this brings me to thinking that, unfortunately, while for the last 3.5 years, the Russia-West relation was kept hostage to the Ukraine conflict, it now seems to change. And the Ukraine conflict may become a hostage to the Russia-West relations. So it was more clear for me more than half a year ago that if we begin with settling Ukraine, we can move other cars as well. I'm not so sure now. And of course, this makes the launching of such an operation much more difficult now than half a year ago. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Andrei. That was, I think, a very important contribution. The next is Klaus Mangold.
Thank you, Wolfgang. I would like to start with a personal and preliminary remark. I was fighting, I believe, for more than 40 years for having better relations between Germany, Europe, and Eastern Europe. And I made a first joint venture in the 80s in Russia. And in my function as the chairman of the Ostausschuss, we were doing everything to improve the relationship between Eastern Europe, including Ukraine, and the West, and especially Germany. And today, I believe, and coming back to what you said before, if you remember, Wolfgang, we had this famous strategic working group. This strategic working group was an invention of Chancellor Schröder and President Putin, asking German business and the public authorities and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to do everything to improve the relations between both countries. And at this time, we were only speaking about how to do better in the relationship between both countries, how to find solutions for modernization and everything. And I believe when I'm looking back, this was really a fascinating time. And we were only talking about a very much better improvement of the world than what we have today. This is my personal remark, and I feel today very frustrated about what's going on between Western Europe, the EU, and Eastern Europe, and mainly Russia. Second, I believe really that the big question will be, seeing the big picture in this world, can we separate other major issues in this world, Syria, Iran, globalization against protectionism, China, US predominancy, and whatever. Can we split this from the Ukrainian case, yes or no? Should we treat Ukraine as a very special, stand-alone, to put it so, issue? Or will we always see that as well Ukraine is a part of the whole big picture? And when I saw what the Secretary General of the UN was saying last Friday, where he said the Cold War today is worse than what we have seen at the beginning of the 60s and 70s. So I believe this should give us some thoughts about if we can really not find a more global approach, including Ukraine. But I have many doubts if it will be possible to have a very clear split between the major issues. And I believe that we have to handle two priority cases where we have people dying every day. This is Ukraine and this is Syria. And this is, I believe, the emergency asking for solutions. And when I'm looking to this, I believe really that one has to think very carefully about if really we can do something separate for Ukraine or if we should have a more global picture. And I was last week in Iran, and I have seen how much people are alarmed in Iran in looking to the world and what could happen as well to them again in a world which is in disorder. And we should not talk so much about the United States position, but as well I believe that we must be very careful that we should not forget the whole big picture in the world. My second remark is a business view about sanctions. I believe that we have lost a lot of momentum in business terms over the last couple of years. And you can have different numbers, but something will be true if we are talking about the damage of German industry, Michael, which is a number roughly between 60 and 80 billions. This would be approximately the same amount for Russia. So we see what the consequences out of the Ukrainian case have been. The German business accepted at the beginning the sanctions, but I believe today we have to be very careful how we handle this in the future. I would like not to be misunderstood. I believe really that we have to have a link between peacemaking in Ukraine, withdrawing the Russian troops, helping to stabilize the borders, and the sanctions. This is for me, no doubt. But the question is how to achieve this. And if I'm looking forward to what the sanctions have achieved, there was always this famous study of the Patterson Institute saying that only in 5 to 10% of all the sanction cases in this world, it was successful. So in other words, around about 80 or 90% of the sanctions in this world failed. And I believe that we are close to see as well that for the case of Russia today has improved over the last 2 years the business climate again. There are more foreign investments coming in than in the years before. And the Russians have shown that they can manage the sanctions by doing more business with China, with Vietnam, with South Korea. And the ones who are suffering most are really the Germans. And you will see this as well now with the last sequence of sanctions from the US, which are mostly affecting two major industries, which are aluminium and others, with prices going up again. And I believe that Russia, when the oil price goes back to a reasonable level of something 70, 80 or something, so I believe really that we will see that Russian business will improve quite well. About Ukraine again in specific, what should we do? I completely agree that the first thing what has to be done is that we talk about a very efficient process by which we bring the Russian troops out of the country. And I believe this is the most important thing which has to be done. The question will be, what is the right tool to achieve this? Is this a UN, or is this the Normandy format? Is this the EU, which I would highly appreciate, should be in a much more dynamic role in this and not being so reluctant as we see it actually, and by which we see as well that the EU is not silent in the Ukrainian case, but taking a more active role. So I'm very much in favor to do something in the overall picture, that we should make a strategy which brings back confidence between us. If I'm going to Russia today, there is mistrust, as we see mistrust as well in the EU and in Germany. The old classical relations by which we have had really good understandings between each other in politics, in business, this is actually over. It's over. And if you talk to Russian business friends, you know since 10, 20 years, and as well with Ukrainians, everybody is frustrated. And I believe that we should look forward by small steps to bring peace to Ukraine, but having in mind as well the big picture. We should not forget that Russia is a geopolitical orientated country, which will certainly have always a look as well what will be the consequences in the peacemaking process in Ukraine as well for Syria and other parts of this world. But to bring back confidence, I believe withdrawing troops to stabilize the border, the mechanisms, I believe the best in place could be the UN in a combination, Wolfgang, with the OSCE, where you have a lot of experience, and to look forward that this is the priority number one, and afterwards to see in which way we can really come back to a strategy of confidence. Look, we have so, and this is what I don't understand, we have so many balls in the hand. Or not in the hand. We have the Brexit, we have the immigration issue, we have the relationship with the United States, which is certainly more orientated to withdraw from European issues. So a peacemaking process in this world without having a new basis of confidence with Russia will simply not work. And I'm very much convinced that this is the very first priority, and that afterwards, Ambassador, we have to talk immediately about how to restructure your country. And what is a joint activity, and we discussed this with Russian entrepreneurs as well in the past. How can we contribute to bring back a situation by which people have something to eat, by which they have reasonable housing, and this will be a challenge for Europe as well as it will be, by the way, a challenge for Russia. This is a joint responsibility which we have. And I'm sure that at the end of the day, I believe that we should, I'm not so much a specialist in who is the best positioned organization, but I could imagine from my point of view that we should start on a greenfield basis. For me, Minsk is not alive anymore. I don't see that Minsk has delivered results in a reasonable time frame and in a consideration of being efficient. So wouldn't it be better to put Minsk aside and to start with very new negotiations and with a very new approach by which we can really start in disconnecting what has been agreed in this Minsk agreement between the most crucial essential points. And this is, I believe, what I would like to encourage all people who have responsibility in this process.
Thank you, Klaus. So that, I think that takes us straight to the last of our panelists, Katja, who I think also intended to take a more strategic look at the relationship. Katja, please.
I prepared a whole lecture here with my notes that I took, but I tried to be very brief. And if I may start on a very small personal note, what I have to say you really breaks my heart. I've been working in, for, and with Russia, former Soviet Union, also Ukraine for many, many years, more than 20 years. And during my time there, I met so many wonderful people, people who never lost their optimism in spite of having lived through a century of revolution, violence, terror, and the most horrendous war that we Germans brought to the Soviet Union. So for me, it was always an essential part of my professional life to try to explain this country to the Germans, to our readers. I now fear that to a certain extent I maybe failed in trying to do this, because what we have to state today is that Russia has left the West. Russia is on a different way, on a different trajectory. And I fear that this will be for a very long time to come. And I can only hope that we, as the West, and especially Germans, being by our history and by our historical responsibilities towards Russia, being so close to Russia, not being its neighbors, because there are quite some countries in between, but we are very close. And I can only hope that we as the West and as Germans, that we will have this patient resolve for many, many years to try to get us closer to each other again. Russia and the West, just a couple of points. Russia and the West, it's a long story, always contradicting relationship, always alternating between closeness and estrangement, war and peace, love and hate. Russia very often had soaring ambitions, mostly, by the way, exceeding its own relative backwardness, and it was haunted also by this backwardness. This is why being at par with the others, being auf Augenhöhe, as the Germans say, at par with the others, was always so important for Russia. And interestingly enough, it was achieved after the victory in the Second World War and during the Cold War, when the nuclear power, superpower Russia, Soviet Union Russia, was on one level talking to the United States. This changed, as we know, fundamentally after 1990 and 1991, the fall of the wall, German reunification, and the establishment of the so-called post-Cold War order put now Russia in a very, very different position. Now, the equality was changed to a narrative and a perception of being second best only. There was the victor, the winner in the Cold War, that where the United States, Russia was left, so to say, at only at the second place at the table. As our friend Andrei Kortunov put it once, invited to pre-dinner drinks, but not invited to dinner itself. This is what we in the West fundamentally underestimated, this feeling of now being, so to say, haunted by the supremacy of the United States and of their, so to say, imposed order. These grievances sit, until today, they sit very deep in many people of the Russian society, and not only in its president and its political elite. The second thing I wanted to point out is how much we in the West underestimated that Russia did not see the benevolent part, the benevolent side of NATO and EU enlargement towards the East. Because in spite of all strategic thinking especially from the side of the United States, there was a benevolent element in it. By pacifying Eastern Europe, by bringing economic and political stability to Eastern Europe, also helping to put stability and a sense of security to Russia's vulnerable western border. Russia did not see these benevolent elements of Western policy. The third point is how much, and now it comes also to Ukraine, how much we underestimated the importance of geopolitics in Russian political thinking. It has to do with the simple fact that there are no, except for the Pacific Ocean, I think there's no so clear borders that Russia has. It has to do with the notion that Russia, being an empire, could always only defend itself by expanding its borders. A quote, by the way, from Catherine the Great, the German on the Russian throne of the Tsars. Geopolitics, a zone of so-called privileged interests in the countries next to the Russian border, including Ukraine. Tough luck, so to say, for them. They were supposed to be, in the end, under Russian influence in order to secure Russia's political and security interests. And the fourth point that we strategically, I think, underestimated was where the domestic repercussions of the relationship between Russia and the West, especially after what happened in 2011 and 2012 in Moscow. You might remember demonstrations, protests against Vladimir Putin, against the Putin as a system, and in order to consolidate power after his re-election 2012, he not only used selective repression, but he mainly used an anti-Western narrative, Russia as a besieged fortress, being haunted by the malicious West, first of all, the United States. All this fueled by a shrieking, I don't know even how to say, by this in-your-face propaganda that really makes your head spin if you listen to it. And sometimes I wonder if those who invented all these narratives, sometimes I wonder if they didn't even start to believe themselves that this all is true, as we now see in the case of Mr. Skripal. Putin's Russia decided to leave the West already 10 or 11 years ago, step by step. And Putin did make his point. Munich Security Conference speech 2007. The first red line drawn in Georgia 2008. Then Ukraine, then geopolitical, if you might say so, expansion also in Syria. And Russia is on a different way. Russia is leaving, or already has left, the West, is now trying to establish itself as a great power in a new post-West multipolar world where mainly three powers share or do not share or fight for their interests, the United States, China, and Russia. There's not so much talk about Europe in this context. The costs, and I finish with this, the costs for the Russian people are so tremendously high. It's not only economic and political stagnation. It's being haunted by these false narratives, a sense of false pride that make many Russians think that they are surrounded by a more and more hostile environment. So how can they come to terms with themselves, with their own history, and with their relationship to countries around them, Ukraine included? As one of Putin's advisors put it, now Russia is on the way to 100, 200, 400 years of solitude.
After 400 years trying to go to the West, now for 100 years Russia has to stay alone. That was Putin's, that was Surkov's.
It's one of Putin's main political advisors. He's now still running the Ukraine desk, so to say. So 100 years of solitude, you know where these words come from. A wonderful book, by the way. And it really, I have to say, it really breaks my heart that apparently Russia is now facing 100 years of solitude, and this means for us we need to be very patient, and we need to work on a very long-term strategy, a generation or more.
Thank you, Katja. Thank you very much. Dear friends, now it's time for discussion. We have a little less than half an hour, but I think we can go a few minutes into overtime because we started late. As you prepare to ask your questions, may I use the privilege of being in the moderator's chair here to ask both Ambassador Melnik and Andrei the following question. We have now heard from almost everybody on the panel how poisoned, how adversarial the relationship, certainly between Russia and the West and Russia and Ukraine has become. A large majority, and I'm sure you would agree with me, a large majority of Ukrainians, if you look at recent polls, believe that the biggest threat to the existence of Ukraine as a sovereign nation is now coming from Russia. And the poisoned atmosphere in Russia, supported by lots of propaganda against the West, is of course extremely worrisome for all of us who believe that we should work to improve this relationship. So here's my question. Let's assume that the UN mission that Minister Gabriel has explained to us how it came about, let's assume the UN mission can be made to work and that the Minsk process can be made to work. My question is, how much work and effort would it take to reverse the atmosphere if, you know, a positive operational process on Donbass can be set in motion? My question is this: is the poisoning so deep that it will take years and years and years, or does it take just one word from President Putin to tell the Russian people, you should now love the West again, and Surkov was wrong, and I'm going to shake hands with Trump tomorrow and conclude the Minsk agreement with President Poroshenko? How deep is the divide now, and how easy or how difficult would it be to close it again if we could make progress on Donbass? Can I have a very quick response from you, and maybe also from you, Katja? But please, Ambassador.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ambassador Ischinger, for this question. I fear that since Ukrainians, and if we speak about the war, then we not just have about 10,000 people dead, not just 1.8 million internally displaced persons, but we have about 500,000, now maybe even more, people who have served in the eastern, on the front line. of the million of Ukrainians. That means there is not a single family which has not been touched by this war, and therefore I think that when the war is over and this peacekeeping mission should have a chance to help to end the war, I fear that it would take years, maybe a decade, to complete the reconciliation. And we know Germany, France, it has lasted over 20 years. I hope we will be faster in that sense, but we should understand that in the Ukrainian society there is no magician that would just make a hint and people would just start loving someone who has betrayed, and we have always been nations, neighbors, close over hundreds of years, sometimes in war, sometimes in peace, but that was a betrayal, and that is something which unfortunately many Russians still do not understand.
Andrei, also please a quick response.
Yes, if there is no actual fighting any longer, of course we would not be able to remove immediately the poisonous of the relationship, but this would be the first very important step toward de-radicalizing the mutual views, and the rest would depend very much on what next steps the nations would take. And of course, if I address the second part of the question, Russia-West, I have my agenda for how we can move, but I believe one important movement would be if Russia and NATO sit together and say, what we did so far did not break the founding act. We are within. Second point, we don't want to lose it. Number three, asking ourselves the question, what shall we do in order not to go beyond the founding act?
Okay, good point. So, who's going to ask the first question? I saw many, why don't you start right here? And then we go to the gentleman in the back.
Thank you. Yeah, my question is to Mr. Gabriel.
And please do me a favor. Identify yourselves, if you could, and please, and also tell us whether your question is a question to the entire panel or to one of the members of the panel.
Yeah, my name is Tim Stadtaus. I'm an MPP student here at Hertie. And my question is to Mr. Gabriel. Mr. Mangal just said he wants more Europe in this, and the EU should take a more active role. Now, you have a very deep experience with the current Chancellor and with the upcoming administration as well. From your point of view, what will it take for the Merkel administration, and Mr. Macron is here in Berlin right now, to make steps towards a more unified European voice on this? Do we need 4 more years until we have actually a new government, or do you think there will be some progress?
So, to debate the role of Europe in international politics, you should invite for a special session in the Hertie School of Governance, because that's a different story. I thought, to explain my position, that when the French President Hollande and the German Chancellor, Madame Merkel, decided to go to Minsk together with Vladimir Putin and the Ukraine President, it was an act where I would say this was a sort of showing European sovereignty by solving a conflict or stopping the danger of further escalation. They acted as part of Europe, but for Europe. To remember, this was the time when the United States, under the Obama administration, discussed to deliver weapons to the Ukraine. There were some folks in the American administration who thought, okay, it will never be possible to win against the Russians this conflict, but maybe at the end, if the conflict is escalating and too many Russian soldiers and people maybe were killed, then the Russians maybe will think about their strategy. And we thought this is a horrible idea to make a conflict inside the Ukraine to a European conflict with Russia. And so the French president and the German chancellor decided to make an own initiative, but of course for Europe. And I think it was a kind of, as I said, showing the United States that Europe is willing and able to have an own initiative and to solve a conflict or to stop the escalation of the conflict. It was the first time when Europe or France and Germany for the European Union tried something like that without have been headed by the United States. Of course, it would be better if the European Union could be more engaged in this conflict. I agree with Mr. Mangold, but I would say we are at the beginning of the debate where it's not in the hands of the European Union, and to be honest, it's not in the hand of the Normandy format if we come to a peacekeeping mission or not. At the end, it's a debate in the Security Council. And what we tried to do in the previous government is to find a common position between the Ukrainian government, the French government, the German government, and the United States, because we have to have a common position in the European, in the UN Security Council. And what we have is a lack of negotiation. I do not have the feeling that there is a real negotiation between the Russian position and the position of the so-called West. But it's, if you want to come to a solution, then you need the Ukrainians, the Russians, the United States, the French and the Brits, and of course at the end China, but China will not reject this, an idea which we can develop. But this is the format where in reality we have to find an idea about a peacekeeping mission in the east of Ukraine. Of course, it has to be prepared and to discussed in the Normandy format, but to be honest, the real powers are more than the 4 guys or women or whoever will meet in the Normandy format. And unfortunately, Europe today is not a real player, as we heard, not only in the conflict with the Ukraine, also in Syria and others, because Europe was founded for interior reasons, to keep peace in the European Union and to develop economic welfare. It was never founded to be a world actor. This was always given to the members of the Security Council. We followed the Brits, the French, and of course, especially the United States. And here in this conflict, we learned that the United States have in different times, different positions. When the Trump administration started, we had a debate among the G7 foreign ministers in Italy, and we tried to debate the situation in the Ukraine. And the answer of the foreign minister was, "Why do you ask me about the Ukraine? It's something you should solve. It's not our responsibility." Some weeks later, we heard the opposite, and so it was difficult to see what kind of direction the American policy will try to go. And unfortunately, I agree. I started also the debate with Vladimir Putin and others that I thought if we can solve the Ukraine issue on the Donbass by a peacekeeping mission, then it would be easier to find back to a better understanding between the so-called West and Russia. So the international situation was a hostile of the Ukraine debate, but unfortunately, I think he's right. Now we are in danger that it's the other way around, which for me has the consequence that even more we have to debate with the Americans, with the French, and the Brits. What can we do to have a real negotiation with the Russians under the umbrella of the Security Council? There are the decision makers, not in Brussels.
Katja.
Just wanted to add one little thing. It's not that the European Union is doing nothing when it comes to Ukraine. It's quite the opposite. Financial commitments of the European Union are the highest, if I'm not mistaken, in any country ever outside the European Union, up to 15 billion euros. And there's hundreds and hundreds of technical projects, advisors, reform ideas, and so on and so forth. The tricky situation for the European Union is that the political situation in Kiev is not a honeymoon either. The political elite in Kiev, at least partly, also uses the war or the unspoken, undeclared war in eastern Ukraine as an argument in a political debate. So the political reform process does not move as fast as it could be. So the crisis, the Donbass, becomes hostage also of internal politics of Ukraine with upcoming presidential and parliamentary elections next year. So I fear, to be honest, 20,000 blue helmets from which country ever, from Sweden, Finland, or whatever, being deployed in Donbass. It's a long haul.
The gentleman in the back, please. Yeah.
Can you?
Yeah.
Evgeny Prekerman from the Minsk Dialogue Track 2 Initiative in Belarus. And I address my question to Mr. Mangold, but we'll be very happy if the others could address it as well. Mr. Mangold, you argued that instead of continuing the negotiations tied to the Minsk Agreement, we should all look for a new negotiation process aimed at restoring trust with Russia. Does it mean that, in your view, we should basically go back to the Helsinki process and revisit it, given the new circumstances we have on the ground today? Or do you think there are other ways of restoring ground in today's world with the Russians? Thanks.
I believe really that looking to the last 2 years since Minsk, I believe really that progress which we have made is limited. And this leads to me, from a business perspective, if I see that I cannot achieve a certain goal under premises which I had defined for a certain period of time, I have to think about what the alternatives are. And this leads me to the conclusion that we have to think about if we are not finding and looking for other alternatives. And I'll go even a little bit further. I believe that as far as peacemaking process is concerned, I'm sure that the UN format, which was mentioned by Herr Gabriel and you, could be a solution. But I believe that we have to go further. We have, in my view, we have to bring back, seeing the overall political landscape in this world, we have to bring back Russia closer to Europe. It's not only up to us to deliver, it's especially as well to make the first steps from the Russian side and to look forward that we can have a peacemaking process. And I agree, I say it again, it's not a question who withdraws sanctions first or who is doing what. I believe this has to be a process in parallel. But I am sure as well that what has been fixed in the coalition agreement, that we say it's a digital solution, either to have 100% fulfilled Minsk or to have sanctions. This is, I believe, something which will not work. And I'm sure that the EU Commission should be, and this is my personal opinion, should be more active. And I'm sure as well that seeing our history, which has been mentioned for a good reason from Katja Kloge as well, for historic reasons, World War II, the peacemaking process with Russia in the reunification process of Germany should lead us to a position that Germany should be as well more active. And I give you a certain kind of a parallelity. Mr. Macron takes the lead today in coordination with his also member states in Europe to push forward the European idea in coordination. So what would be wrong if the German government as well would try to look forward to be more dynamic in this process, seeing our history, seeing our business relations, seeing the perspective in the future, in this peacemaking process and in the orientation of Russia. You know, if you would like to do something for, and I know a lot of Russian factories, you cannot restructure the Russian industry without Western help. And without Western support, the Chinese will go for their very own egoistic interest. We have always in mind to have a bigger view. So I believe that we are much better positioned to support this. So what I'm asking for is a more dynamic role of Germany, of Europe. And you look, the Americans are much more away from us. And seen as well the declarations of the American president, who wants not to be so much now, he has done something different in Syria. But for Russia, I believe that he will continue to be quite reluctant as far as the peacemaking process in Europe is concerned. And without Russia, it will be difficult to see Europe in a strong position.
Andre, and then we'll take two final questions.
Just briefly, I always say to my eldest son, don't leave a job unless you have found a new one. So wait until you have found a new one, and then you can leave the one which you don't like. If I would see any better solution than Minsk, I would be happy to embrace it. As long as I don't see anyone, okay, I will be very hesitant to skip it. And coming back to the issue of our discussion tonight, peacekeeping, I cannot go to the UN Security Council saying, okay, I skip Minsk, I need something different, and on a different basis I would launch a peace operations. It doesn't work. To launch a peacekeeping operation, you require to have a peace to be kept. And this is a privilege for an opportunity for the UN, because we have Minsk, and the UN would step in support of Minsk. If you want something different, you have to first negotiate something different, and would forget for a while about the peace operation.
And by the way, only one remark. If you would kill Minsk, you have to answer all the questions which are addressed in Minsk. There's no new question and no new answer. You will come to the same situation like we had before Minsk, and so it makes no sense. It's difficult to implement Minsk, that's of course, but there is no. I cannot see that there is a new answer or a new solution coming from heaven. So you will end up in the same situation. Secondly, I mean, the truth is, and Katja Gloga said it just before, that needs that the Ukraine also has to have an interest in Minsk. To be honest, I mean, the difficulty of Minsk was always that there was no ownership by the Ukraine from the very beginning. The Ukraine accepted the Minsk agreement because they were just before losing a war. And then they accepted Minsk because their idea and their strategy to win about the separatists had no chance they hadn't a chance to win the war against the separatists, because the Russians gave support to the separatists. And then the Ukraine was willing to accept the Minsk agreement, but they never discussed it with their own citizens that it is also in the interest of the Ukraine to implement Minsk. And there are a lot of examples that publicly everybody says, yes, we agree to the Minsk agreement, that if it comes to the detail, then they rejected in the parliament everything. I would say today, even if the government would try to implement parts of the Minsk agreement, they would not get a majority in the Ukraine parliament. So also therefore we need steps forward for ceasefire and withdrawal of the heavy weapons to show to the Ukraine citizens and to the public in the Ukraine that there is progress. Without progress in the issue of ceasefire, without progress in the issue of withdrawal of the heavy weapons, nobody will have interest in the implementation of Minsk, even in the Ukraine. So it's not only a debate about the position of Russia, it's also a debate about the position of the Ukraine and the solution can be to have the first small step in these Minsk agreement, and this is ceasefire and withdrawal of the heavy weapons. That's the reason why I very much supported this idea of the peacekeeping mission. And of course it's difficult, but I mean, normally we are in a time where we should not say there is no alternative. There's always an alternative, but not a better one.
We've actually run out of time, but I'll take two more questions, and then we'll go for some quick responses. There was the lady in the third row.
Hi, I'm a PhD student at the German Economic Institute here close by. My question maybe is a little out of topic, but not about peacekeeping, but more somehow provocative. We are, from this discussion, it's clear that we are very Western-centric, and Russia is very geopolitical oriented. So are we maybe forgetting about which role our countries around Ukraine, are the Baltic countries, is Moldova, Romania, and these kind of Eastern countries playing in this conflict? Are spillovers effect could they be very strong on these countries? And if yes, are we maybe gonna run the risk to lose them in our purpose, in our aim of kind of connecting to Russia and connecting to Russia to Europe and to us? So which are the spillovers effect on these countries, and are we going to lose maybe them due to maybe other conflicts or separatist movement occurring there? Thank you.
Okay, and I'll take the last question from gentleman in the first row.
Hi, my name is Ivan Zhang. I'm second-year MIA student. I'm currently writing my thesis on NATO and Russia relations. I just want to thank Mrs. Katia that you've beautifully put basically the summary of my thesis. I have basically two questions. In my findings, so one of the things that kind of going back to the big picture and being held hostage, that one of the things was basically NATO enlargement and creating this mistrust in Russia. So my question is where Ukraine stands as in its readiness in joining NATO or the EU. And my second question is do you think that there's a need to rethink NATO enlargement? How should we kind of build this European security architecture that we currently have? And thank you.
These are two great concluding questions, and I think we'll go first to the ambassador, and then whoever else wants to chime in, please.
Thank you so much, but let me first very, very briefly react to the last point that Minister Gabriel made. Minsk is not very popular in Ukraine, that's true, but I would not say that there is no majority in the parliament. And the last example, in autumn, a law was voted in the parliament on the prolongation of the special status. This is part of the Minsk, our political commitment, because the first law we passed was just for 3 years. And irrespective of all the difficulties, and the Ukrainians are not the biggest fans of the Minsk agreement, we could find not just a majority, but almost a constitutional majority. That means that also the opposition parties, they voted for Minsk. And that was, to my view, a very important signal that once the Ukrainians see that we are on a good track, and you are right, the ceasefire is essential. The military aspects must be finished as soon as possible. Then, of course, this support would be even stronger. But I would not say that Minsk is no go for Ukrainians. It is a difficult topic, but we are trying to make our homework. And regarding your questions, we would welcome, of course, a more active role of our neighbors, and we think that there is such an ambition from Poland, Baltic states. They try to contribute to the process, and therefore I would not say that it is not there. I mean, the countries they feel that in their vicinity this conflict is also a danger to themselves. And to your question, if I may. it has always been a case that Ukraine has been seen as a stumbling block on the relations between Russia and the West, broadly speaking. And for us Ukrainians, it is a bit insulting. I mean, the very idea that why should someone now in the 21st century decide how our destiny should look like in 10 or 15 or 20 years. I mean, this is something which we think that Ukrainians themselves are ready and capable to do. And of course, we are the first ones who are interested that this relationship between the West and Russia would be improving, because I mean, you were speaking about the economic losses for Germany. We don't think that they are, because of the sanctions, that these losses are really so tremendous. That there are many studies, but for us, Russia was 33% of our trade was Russia. Now it's less than 8 in 4 hours. In 4 years, sorry. Therefore, we are also suffering because of that conflict, and therefore we would be the first to welcome the improvement of this relationship. But as Ms. Gloger rightly put it, it is not the West, it is Russia which has decided to strike another path and to go in another direction from the West. And therefore, it is not for us and not for the West, not for the Germany to decide. I think that's the Russian presidency and the people, that they should think what future they would like to have, to live in a democracy in this European and to stick to the values which we share, or to go 100 years of solitude again with China or wherever this path might lead. Therefore, I think we must be clear on that. Thank you.
Okay, I think that was a pretty good concluding point. Any final point, Andre, please?
Thank you, and thank you very much for the questions. Just 2 points which I believe are important. When we discuss European security order these days, we are too much focused on Russia-West relations, and we shall not forget that European security architecture can be solid and sustainable only if it also takes into consideration the security interests of smaller states, in particular of those who are not members in any alliances. This is often very much out of the focus, but without fixing this issue, it will be very difficult to come back to any viable European security architecture. And the second point would be, and this is related to some extent to the first question, we need to ask ourselves the question whether or not and in which way we can reconcile the very different views of European security by Russia and the West and many other countries. And among many questions, the most important and most controversial one is the issue of the relationship between the freedom of alliances and another commitment under the OSCE documents, that by exercising the freedom of alliances, states must take into consideration legitimate security concerns of other countries. And I would like to remind you that we once did it, and this was in the late 1990s when the first NATO enlargement round was under discussion. And we did it perfectly at that time, from 97 through 99, and this is probably one of the very few things which still hold in the European security system. So we need to come back to taking concerns into account without giving a veto power. And that's very important. That's difficult often, but that's very important.
Thank you very much, Andre. I think this, I'm really sorry. I think we could have gone on for another hour, but it's a warm evening. I think everybody wants to go out and have a beer or a glass of wine. So we as a panel don't want to stand in between you and the refreshments. But let me conclude this by one remark. I hope some of the students will, among the takeaways from this, not only have conclusions about the business aspects and the domestic Ukrainian aspects and the historic aspects that were raised. It's also about how difficult foreign policy is and how difficult peace negotiations are. Often, what is desirable actually turns out not to be possible. And often what is possible is, well, maybe desirable, but is not sufficient. So we often hang in between, and in this Ukrainian crisis mode, I think this is a perfect example of how even the best of intentions run into these dilemmas of the desirable and the possible and the domestic constraints. So let's thank our panel. Could we please give a hand to the panel?